letting it cool off of here, although it's still 172, so.
In 1955, Chevrolet unveiled an engine that nobody took seriously. It was small, it was cheap, and on paper, it had no business competing with the monsters coming out of Detroit. The big block era was in full swing. Displacement was king. And yet this little 265 cubic inch V8 would evolve into something that changed everything. They called it the small block. And within a decade, it would become the most produced engine in automotive history. This is the story of the Chevy 350 and how it outsmarted every big block that tried to bury it. Along the way, we'll see engineering revolutions, racing victories, and a philosophy that proved bigger isn't always better. So let's begin. But first, what exactly was the automotive world like when this engine was born? The 1950s were a strange time for American cars. The post-war boom had created a nation of consumers who wanted more of everything: more chrome, more tail fins, more power. And the big three were happy to oblige. Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors were locked in a horsepower war that seemed to have only one rule: bigger engines win. The logic was simple. Want more power? Add more displacement. A 350 cubic inch engine not cutting it? Build a 400, still not enough? How about a 454? The engineers in Detroit had convinced themselves that there was no replacement for displacement. And for a while they were right. The big blocks dominated. They won races. They sold cars. They became symbols of American excess and engineering might. But here's the thing. Big blocks had problems. Serious problems that nobody wanted to talk about. They were heavy, really heavy. A typical big block added hundreds of pounds to the front of a car, which meant worse handling, worse braking, and worse fuel economy. Not that anyone cared about fuel economy in 1955. Gas was cheap, roads were straight, and nobody was thinking about the future. Well, almost nobody. There was a man named Ed Cole at Chevrolet who saw things differently. Cole was an engineer's engineer, the kind of guy who looked at a problem and refused to accept the obvious solution. When everyone else was building bigger engines, Cole asked a simple question. What if we could get the same power from a smaller package? I mention this because without Ed Cole, the small block Chevrolet simply doesn't exist. He championed the project from the beginning, pushing his team to think differently about engine design. The goal wasn't just to build a small V8. The goal was to build a small V8 that could punch above its weight. The original small block, that 265 cubic inch engine from 1955, was revolutionary in ways that aren't immediately obvious. See, Cole and his team made a decision that would define the architecture for decades. They designed the engine with what they called a 90-degree V configuration, with a compact deck height and a bore spacing that allowed for significant displacement increases down the road. This is important. Most engines are designed for a specific size and stay there. The small block was designed to grow. It was basically future-proofed from day one. The 265 could become a 283. The 283 could become a 327. And eventually the 327 could become the legendary 350. But anyway, back to the beginning. The 1955 Chevrolet with that first small block wasn't supposed to be a performance car. Chevrolet was the economy brand, the sensible choice, your father's car. But something happened when that 265 hit the streets. People started winning races with it. Not because they had more power than the competition, but because they had enough power with a lot less weight. The hot rodders figured it out first. They always do. Take a light Chevy, drop in that new V8, and suddenly you had something that could embarrass cars with twice the displacement. The power-to-weight ratio was phenomenal, and unlike the big blocks, you could actually stop the thing when you needed to. By 1957, Chevrolet had bumped the displacement to 283 cubic inches. And here's where it gets interesting. They introduced fuel injection as an option. 1 horsepower per cubic inch. That was the magic number everyone was chasing, and Chevrolet got there first with a small block. Think about that. A 283 cubic inch engine making 283 horsepower. The big block guys didn't know what to do with themselves. Now, the fuel injection was temperamental. Kind of finicky, honestly. Most people stuck with carburetors. But the point had been made. The small block wasn't just competitive, it was setting the standard. The 1960s brought the muscle car era, and this is where the small block story gets complicated. Because Chevrolet was building big blocks too, the 396, the 427, the 454. These were monsters, pure displacement plays that made ridiculous power and sounded like thunder. The marketing guys loved them, the drag racers loved them, and for a while it seemed like the small block might get left behind. But it didn't. And the reason it didn't is the reason this engine became legend. The small block kept evolving. In 1967, Chevrolet introduced the 350 cubic inch version, and this is the engine that would conquer the world. 350 cubic inches of displacement might not sound impressive compared to a 454, but the 350 had something the big blocks never would: versatility. See, the 350 could be anything you wanted it to be. Need a reliable daily driver? The 350 could do that. Want to go road racing? The 350 was light enough to handle corners. Building a drag car on a budget? The 350 made excellent power for the money. Stuffing an engine into a sports car where space was tight? The 350 actually fit. The big blocks couldn't do all of that. They were one-trick ponies, straight-line speed, and that was about it. If you've made it this far, you're probably into this kind of stuff. Quick question: where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. And hey, subscribe if you haven't. We do this every week. All right, back to the 350. The Corvette proved the small block's potential better than anything else. Chevrolet's sports car had been using small blocks since 1955, and when the 350 arrived, it became the standard Corvette engine. Not because it was cheaper than a big block option, but because it made the car better. Better balanced, better handling, better in the ways that actually mattered when the road started turning. Professional racers noticed the small block Corvettes were competitive against cars with significantly more displacement. At Sebring, at Daytona, at Le Mans, these little engines were running with the big boys, and sometimes beating them. The Z28 Camaro is another perfect example. When Chevrolet wanted to go Trans Am racing in 1967, they didn't reach for a big block. They built a special 302 cubic inch small block right at the limit of the class rules. That engine, revving to stratospheric RPMs for an American pushrod V8, proved that the small block architecture could be tuned for high-performance applications that would destroy a big block. The 302 screamed. It made its power at the top of the rev range, like a European sports car engine. And it helped the Z28 win championships. I mean, here was Chevrolet, a company known for making family sedans, beating the best sports cars in the world with an engine that shared its basic architecture with what went into pickup trucks. But the 350's real genius wasn't on the racetrack. It was in the showroom. By the early 1970s, the world was changing. The muscle car era was dying. Emissions regulations were coming. Insurance companies were crushing the youth market with ridiculous rates for high-powered cars. And then, in 1973, the oil crisis hit. Suddenly, that 454 big block didn't seem so clever. 8 miles per gallon will do that. The big block started disappearing from option sheets. Too heavy, too thirsty, too much of everything the market no longer wanted. But the 350 survived. It adapted. Chevrolet could detune it for economy, meeting the new emission standards while still providing acceptable performance. It was, honestly, kind of remarkable. The same basic engine that had won races in the 1960s was now powering family cars through the malaise era. The numbers tell the story. By the end of production, Chevrolet had built over 100 million small block engines. 100 million. That's not a typo. No other engine in history comes close to those production numbers. The small block went into Camaros and Corvettes, obviously, but also into pickup trucks, vans, SUVs, sedans, station wagons, and just about everything else Chevrolet made. Think about the economics of that for a second. When you're building that many engines, your cost per unit drops to almost nothing. The tooling is paid off. The suppliers are giving you bulk discounts. The assembly line workers can build them in their sleep. Chevrolet could put a V8 into a vehicle for barely more than a six-cylinder, and they did exactly that. The big block manufacturers couldn't compete on cost, they just couldn't. Lower production volumes meant higher per-unit costs. And when fuel economy became a selling point instead of a joke, the big blocks had nothing to offer. Now, I should mention the aftermarket, because that's a huge part of the small block story. When you build 100 million of something, you create an ecosystem. Every speed shop in America knew the small block inside and out. Every parts manufacturer made components for it. You could walk into any auto parts store in the country and find what you needed to rebuild or modify a small block Chevy. Try doing that with some exotic engine. Good luck. But the small block? The knowledge was everywhere. The parts were everywhere. And that accessibility created a feedback loop. More people bought small blocks because parts were available. More parts became available because people bought small blocks. The engine became self-reinforcing. The hot rodders who had discovered the small block in 1955 passed their knowledge to the next generation, and the next, and the next. By the time I was growing up, the small block Chevy wasn't just an engine choice, it was the default choice. If you were building something and didn't have a specific reason to use something else, you used a small block. Because why wouldn't you? The engineering advantages compound over time too. Chevrolet's engineers kept refining the design, better heads, better intake manifolds, better oiling systems. Each generation of the small block was better than the last, but they all shared that same basic architecture, that same compact, lightweight, versatile foundation that Ed Cole's team had laid in 1955. Let's talk about specific numbers, because numbers matter. A well-built 350 can make 400 horsepower without doing anything exotic. Aluminum heads, a good cam, headers, and a proper tune, that's it. 400 reliable horsepower from an engine that costs maybe $3,000 to build from scratch. More if you want, but that's a solid baseline. Now try to get 400 horsepower from a big block. You can do it, sure. But the engine will cost more to build. It will weigh more. It will use more fuel, and it won't fit in as many applications. The math just doesn't work in the big block's favor unless you specifically need massive torque at low RPM. And here's the thing about torque. The small block makes plenty of it. Maybe not as much as a 454, but enough for any reasonable application. The deficit in torque is more than offset by the advantages in weight and packaging. A small block Camaro accelerates as fast as a big block Camaro because the weight difference compensates for the power difference. Road racing proved this definitively. When you have to turn the car, weight matters a lot. Those big block Corvettes of the late 1960s were monsters in a straight line, but they pushed like shopping carts in the corners. The small block cars were just better balanced, better to drive, more competitive overall. The professional teams figured this out quickly. By the early 1970s, most serious Corvette racing programs had switched to small blocks. The engines made enough power, and everything else about the car worked better with the lighter, more compact package. Speaking of compact, let's talk about the small block in unexpected applications. This is one of my favorite parts of the story. Because the small block was so compact, it fit in places no American V8 had any business being. Kit cars, imported sports cars, boats, airplanes. Yes, airplanes. There are small block Chevys powering experimental aircraft right now. The engine is light enough, reliable enough, and powerful enough to work in applications far beyond what it was designed for. The marine industry absolutely loved the small block. Boat engines need to be reliable above all else. Breaking down on the water is dangerous in ways that breaking down on the road isn't. The small block's proven reliability and parts availability made it the default choice for stern drives and inboard applications. Even today, boats are being powered by small block architecture engines, industrial applications too, generators, pumps, equipment that needs to run for thousands of hours without failing. The small block does that. It's not sexy, but it's important. When you need an engine that just works, day after day, year after year, the small block has a track record that few engines can match. Now, I want to talk about what the big blocks got wrong. Because it wasn't that they were bad engines, they weren't. The Chevrolet big blocks, the 396 and 427 and 454, were magnificent pieces of engineering. They made tremendous power. They won races. They have their own devoted following. But they solved the wrong problem. The big block philosophy assumed that power would always be the primary concern, that displacement would always be cheap, that fuel would always be abundant, that regulations would never tighten. None of those assumptions held up. The small block philosophy assumed that efficiency mattered, that weight mattered, that versatility mattered, that an engine needed to work in multiple applications to justify its development costs. All of those assumptions proved correct. It's the difference between optimizing for one scenario versus optimizing for many scenarios. The big block was better in specific situations. The small block was good enough in almost all situations. And good enough across 100 million applications beats perfect in a few million applications. Engineering is about trade-offs, always. And the small block made the right trade-offs for the real world rather than the racing world. The legacy continues. In 1992, Chevrolet introduced the LT1, a modern interpretation of the small block with improvements everywhere. In 1997, the LS1 arrived, a clean-sheet redesign that maintained the small block philosophy while updating everything else. The LS engines became their own legend, dominating the performance world for the next 2 decades. And right now, as I'm telling you this story, Chevrolet is still making small blocks. The current generation, called the LT series, powers everything from the Corvette to the Silverado. The architecture has evolved completely since 1955. Not a single part interchanges, but the philosophy remains. Compact, lightweight, efficient, versatile. Ed Cole would recognize what his descendants are doing. He'd appreciate the engineering. He'd understand the trade-offs. And I think he'd be proud that his approach proved correct, even if he couldn't have imagined 100 million engines. And what of those big blocks? Chevrolet stopped producing them for passenger cars in the 1970s. The last big block Corvette was 1974. The last big block Camaro was 1974. They hung on in trucks a bit longer, where the torque advantages still made sense. But eventually, improved small blocks could match the big block torque while using less fuel, and the rationale disappeared. The 454 became a nostalgia item, something people remembered fondly from the muscle car era. Collectors restore big block cars and pay premiums for them, but nobody is building new big blocks for practical applications. The need simply doesn't exist. Meanwhile, you can walk into a Chevrolet dealership right now and buy a new vehicle with a small block. The lineage is unbroken since 1955, nearly 70 years of continuous production and evolution. No other engine comes close. That's the difference between an engine that was right for its moment and an engine that was right for every moment. The big blocks had their era. The small block had every era. The Chevy 350 didn't outsmart the big blocks by being faster. It outsmarted them by being smarter, by being more adaptable, by being good enough at everything instead of perfect at one thing. The market chose versatility over specialization, and 100 million engines later, that choice looks more correct than ever. So the next time someone tells you there's no replacement for displacement, tell them about the small block Chevy. Tell them about an engine that was supposed to be too small to matter. Tell them about the engineers who understood that power is only one variable in a very complex equation. And that is the story of the Chevy 350. Subscribe if you want more, and let me know in the comments. Have you ever owned something with a small block? I'm curious. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.